She was 22 and flat broke. Not down to her last coins broke, all the way to the bottom broke. The kind where you count what you have 3 times because you cannot believe the number stays the same. And with $10, the last money she had in the world, she bought a caved-in livery stable on the wrong end of a fading cattle town in the Montana Territory, a building the town had condemned and left to the swallows. The great hay door hung off one hinge. The corral rails had rotted to splinters. The blacksmith who owned the shop next door told her a woman couldn't run a livery, that the roof would come down by winter, and that she'd thrown her last dollars into a hole. But what nobody knew, not the smith, not the town, not the girl herself, was that beneath the feed bin at the back of that ruined stable, under the grain and the dust and the years, was something that had been hidden there in 1878, and it would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Wren Delacroix had grown up with horses and without much else. She was born in 1869 in a Montana cattle town, the daughter of a stockhand who was better with a green colt than with people, and her mother had died bringing her into the world, so it had been the 2 of them from the start, the quiet father and the girl who learned to read a horse before she learned to read a book. By the time she was 10, she could gentle a spooked mare with her voice alone. By the time she was 14, she was breaking horses for wages, small and fearless in a corral. Because a horse does not care whether you are a girl, only whether your hands are honest and your seat is quiet. Her hands were honest. It was the one thing everyone agreed on about Wren Delacroix, and for most of her life it was also the only thing. Her father worked for a big outfit called the Ivory Cross, a cattle company owned by a man named Harlan Skier, who had come into the country after the war with money nobody could quite trace and had bought up range and water and men until he owned most of the valley. Skier paid in scrip and promises and kept his hands in debt to his own commissary, the old company trick, so that a man could work the Ivory Cross 20 years and end poorer than he started. Wren's father worked at 18. When he was thrown from a horse in the spring of 1889 and died 3 days later of what the bones did to him inside. The Ivory Cross paid for the pine box and then presented Wren, 20 years old and freshly orphaned, with a bill, her father's commissary debt, they said, and family was liable. She had nothing to pay it with but the only thing she owned, and so Harlan Skier's foreman took her father's saddle horse, a good bay gelding her father had raised from a fall. And Wren stood in the yard and watched them lead him away, and understood for the first time exactly how the valley was built. She had watched her father die by inches long before the horse threw him, she understood later. 18 years of scrip that bought less every season, of a commissary that carried a man deeper the harder he worked, of tipping his hat to a man who owned the ground he'd wear out his life on. That was the real thing that killed him, and the horse only finished it. On the day they led the bay away, she did not cry, because crying was a thing you did where no one from the Ivory Cross could see it. She waited until she was alone in the empty bunkhouse that had been her home, and then she did not cry either, because something harder than grief had come into her and taken the place where crying lived. She made herself a promise instead, plain and square the way she wrote her name, that someday she would own one patch of ground and one roof and one corral that no bill, no debt, no man with untraceable money could ever take from her. She was 20 years old and she had nothing, and she held that promise the way a rider holds the one rein that still answers when a horse is running away. For 2 years after that she drifted and worked, breaking horses for outfits that would hire a woman, sleeping in bunkhouses and haylofts, saving what scrip converted to real coin, because she had one idea in her head and it never left. Her own place. Not big. Just hers. A corral no one could lead a horse out of because a bill said so. She was 22, with $10 finally saved in hard money, when she heard from a freighter that the old livery stable in a town called Bishop's Fork was up for the taxes. The town had condemned it. Nobody wanted it. $10, and it was yours. Bishop's Fork was a cattle town going quietly to seed, half its trade lost when the railhead moved east, and Wren rode in on a borrowed horse and looked at the ruined livery at the wrong end of the street and saw, past the caved roof and the hanging door, the one thing she had wanted her whole life, a place with a corral that could be hers, for exactly the money she had. She found the town's business at the bank, a narrow brick building with a narrow man inside it named Orrin Tice, who handled Bishop's Fork's affairs and looked at the girl in the trail, worn calico dress the way a man looks at a bad debt, walking in the door. The livery, Tice told her, was a hazard. The town had condemned it 2 years back after the roof partly fell. The previous owner had died owing taxes, and a stable was a strange thing for a young woman to buy in any case. There was nothing in it, he said, but rotted harness and a hayloft full of pigeons, and the smart money said, tear it down for the lumber. $10 would make it hers, taxes and all, but he told her plainly she was buying a condemned building the town would just as soon see burned. Wren counted $10 onto the counter in coins she had earned one broken colt at a time, and signed her name, Wren Delacroix, in a plain square hand, and Tice gave her a padlock key, and the opinion, unasked, that she'd regret it by snowfall. By the time she reached the livery, it was already going around Bishop's Fork that some horse-breaking girl had bought the condemned stable at the end of the street. The blacksmith next door, a big red-faced man named Cyrus Boone, leaned in his shop door and watched her fight the hanging hay door open and told her, conversationally, that a livery needed a man's arm and a man's credit, that the roof would finish falling by winter, and that she'd thrown good money after a bad building. The men at the saloon laid the usual bets. Bishop's Fork had watched its luck run out slowly for a decade, and it had learned to expect nothing, and a girl with $10 and a condemned stable was, to the town, just one more small mistake it had seen before. The hay door gave at last, and she stepped into the ruin, and she did not see a ruin. She saw the bones of a good stable, a broad center aisle, a double row of stalls in oak, gone gray, but solid, the great hayloft above with light coming through the broken shakes in long dusty bars, and at the back, past the last stalls, the feed room with its heavy grain bins built low against the wall. It smelled of old hay and pigeon and dry rot, but under that, faint and permanent, it smelled of horse, the one smell in the world that had ever meant safety to her. She walked the length of the aisle, running her hand along the stall tops, and a barn swallow shot out through a gap in the roof, and Wren Delacroix stood in the wreck of her $10 stable and felt, for the first time since they'd let her father's bay out of the yard, that she was standing somewhere she could not be made to leave. That first night she made a bed of clean straw in the driest back stall and lay listening to the building around her, the wind working at the loose shakes, the pigeons stirring in the loft, a loose board somewhere ticking against a joist. To another person, it would have been a lonely, frightening sound. A condemned barn breathing in the dark at the wrong end of a dying town. To Wren, it was the most peaceful sound she had ever heard, because every note of it belonged to her. She had slept in a dozen other men's haylofts and a dozen other outfits' bunkhouses, always on sufferance, always one word from a foreman away from the road. This roof was hers, holes and all. This straw was hers. When she finally slept, she slept the way she had not slept since she was a child with a father in the next room, deep and without dreams, and she woke at first light to bars of gold coming through the broken shakes and lay a while just looking at them, at her own light coming through her own roof, and did not get up until she was ready. She had $10 gone and nothing coming in, so she paid the only way she ever had, with work and with horses. The opening came from an unlikely place. A rancher's wife brought a lamed carriage horse to the smith next door, and Cyrus Boone, who could shoe but could not doctor, could do nothing for the animal's cracked hoof and torn temper. Wren asked to see it. She spent an hour in the smith's yard with her hands and her voice, and by evening the horse that had tried to kill 2 men stood quiet for her poultice, and word of that traveled Bishop's Fork faster than any bet. A woman who could gentle a killer carriage horse was a woman worth knowing in a town that lived on horses. After that she had work, colts to break, spoiled horses to fix, a lame team to nurse, and slowly the ruined livery began to fill again, a boarder here, a broken colt there, coin trickling in $1 at a time. Even Cyrus Boone came around. In his way, a livery next to a smithy is good for both, and he found he could sell more shoes with the Delacroix girl sending him trade. And grudging respect grew up between the forge and the stable the way it does between 2 people who are good at hard things. There was an old man, too, who took to sitting on an upturned bucket in the sun by the stable door most afternoons, Ned Ashby, who had freighted in the valley 40 years and had nowhere in particular to be since his wife passed. He remembered the livery when it ran, remembered when Bishop's Fork had been somebody, and he told Wren the town's whole history in installments, unasked, the way lonely old men do. Some of it she half listened to, but some of it she filed away, because Ned Ashby remembered the valley before Harlan Skier owned it, and he spoke of the Ivory Cross with a low, careful bitterness, and he was the first to tell Wren, not knowing what she already carried in her own history, that half the graves in the valley had Skier's hand on the shovel, if a body only knew where to dig. She had said nothing, but she had remembered, and when the letter under the feed bin later spoke of the same man, it was Ned Ashby's bitter afternoon voice she heard reading it. She restored the stable the way she gentled a horse, patiently from the ground up, asking nothing of it faster than it could give. She and a hired boy hauled out the fallen shakes and laid new ones from the smith's scrap lumber. She rebuilt the corral rails, split and set them herself until the pen would hold a horse again. She cleaned the stalls down to good oak and the harness room down to what could be saved. And the last room she came to, because it was the deadest and the least urgent, was the feed room at the back, where the low grain bins stood against the wall full of 13-year-old spoiled grain gone to dust and weevil. She meant only to empty them and put them back to use. She had no notion they held anything but ruin. It was the floor that gave up the secret, and it was a horse that led her to it. She had a nervous 3-year-old filly stabled in the back stall that autumn, and the filly would not settle. She pawed and fretted and stared at the feed-room wall, night after night, the way a horse stares at a thing that is wrong. Wren trusted horses more than she trusted people, and a horse that will not settle is telling the truth about something. So she went into the feed-room with a lamp one night to find what the filly was seeing, and she stood where the filly stared. And she felt it before she understood it. The floor under the largest feed bin gave, just slightly, under her boot. A soft spot, a place where the packed earth and plank floor of a stable had a hollow beneath it. She dragged the great feed bin aside. It took her the better part of an hour, empty as it was, and there, where it had stood for 13 years, the floor was not floor. It was a fitted trapdoor of oak planks, cut to the grain of the surrounding boards, dusted over and hay-strewn so that no one who had not felt it flex would ever have found it. A stable is the last place on earth anyone thinks to look for a hidden thing, because a stable is filth and animals and honest labor, and that, Wren would come to understand, was exactly the point. She got her fingers into the gap and lifted, and the trapdoor came up on leather hinges gone stiff, and the lamp showed her a dry cellar the size of a horse stall dug into the Montana earth, and on a shelf of planed boards, wrapped in canvas and oilcloth against the damp, a long flat bundle, a small iron-strapped chest, and a folded letter weighted with a horseshoe worn thin by a horse that had died before she was born. For a long moment, she did not go down. She knelt at the edge of the open trap with the lamp held over the dark and simply looked, the way she would study a new horse across a corral before she ever laid a hand on it, letting the thing show her its nature. The air that came up out of the hole was cool and dry and old, 13 years of stopped time rising past her face. She thought, absurdly, that she ought to be afraid. A hidden cellar under a condemned floor is the stuff of every dark story told around a stove. But she was not afraid. The filly overhead had gone quiet the moment the trap came up, as if the animal had been waiting all autumn for someone to answer the question it kept asking, and that quiet settled Wren the way a settled horse always settled her. She took up the lamp and climbed down the 3 earthen steps into the dark, and knelt on the packed floor, and reached for the letter first, because a letter is a voice, and she wanted to know whose ground she was standing on before she touched what he had left. Her hands were steady, because a horsewoman's hands are trained to be steady, but she knelt down slow. The letter was on top, the paper foxed brown, the ink faded but the hand strong and slanting, a working man's careful letters. It read, "To whoever finds this, and if you found it because a horse told you, or because you know a stable floor by heart, and either way you are the kind I hoped for." His name was Amos Kettleman, and he had built and run the Bishop's Fork livery for 30 years, and he had a story to tell that the valley had never known the true shape of. It went back to 1878, to the years when Harlan Skier and the Ivory Cross were fastening their grip on the country. Wren's breath caught at the name. She read it twice to be sure the years had not put it there out of her own history. But it was there. Skier, the same man. Kettleman's livery in those days was the one place in the valley Skier did not own, a public stable, where every cowman and freighter and homesteader stabled his horse and, over coffee in the harness room, talked. And Amos Kettleman, who kept his mouth shut and his ears open the way a good liveryman does, had heard, year over year, the whole architecture of how Skier took the valley, the water claims filed under dead men's names, the homesteaders run off with hired guns, the tally books cooked, the small ranchers foreclosed by a bank Skier secretly owned. Kettleman had heard it all, from the men who did it drunk and the men it was done to sober, and because he was that kind of man, he had written it down. Names, dates, the location of the falsified water filings, the names of Skier's hired men, and the graves of 2 homesteaders the valley believed had simply moved on. Years of it, in a plain square hand not unlike Wren's own. "I am an old man now," the letter said, "and my heart is bad, and Skier owns the judge, the bank, and the marshal. So this is worth my life the day it leaves this hole. I have kept it against a day when Skier's reach ends, for reach always ends, in a man's own death, if nothing sooner. And someone honest holds this stable, someone the valley trusts, who can carry the truth to a law that will finally hear it. I do not know when that day comes. I only know to leave it where a good liveryman will find it, because a good liveryman is an honest soul or the horses would say otherwise." And then there was the other thing, wrapped separate in the oilcloth. Amos Kettleman had run the only honest stable in a valley built on Skier's debt, and a great many men had paid their board over 30 years, and Kettleman had done with his savings what a man does who has watched a bank foreclose his neighbors for sport. He had kept his money out of it. Gold coin, 30 years of livery fees and horse trading profit, in the iron-strapped chest, and its sum was written plain at the letter's end. Wren read it, and read it again, because she counted everything twice, near $5,000 in hard gold, in a country where she had watched them take her father's one good horse for a commissary debt. The gold is for the finder. The letter closed. A stable is honest work, and honest work should end in something. But the papers are a debt owed to every family this valley lost, and I could not pay it living. Pay it for me, if you can. See that Skier's dead hand lets go at last. A. Kettleman, his mark 1878, she sat back on her heels on the cold cellar floor, with the letter in her hand and the lamp throwing her shadow up the earth wall, and the filly shifted overhead. Quiet now, settled now that the wrong thing had been brought into the light. Wren Delacroix, whose father had died owing a debt to Harlan Skier, who had watched them lead her father's horse out of the yard for that debt, knelt in a hidden cellar holding the proof that would break the man who built the valley on debts exactly like it. She did not feel lucky. Luck was not a word that fit the shape of it. She felt aimed, as if 13 years back a dying liveryman had loaded a truth into the dark and pointed it down the years, and it had traveled all that way to land, of all the hands in Montana, in hers. She learned quickly that the reckoning was not simple, because Harlan Skier was 14 years older but not yet dead, and still owned the judge and the bank and a good part of the marshal. This was the danger, and Wren was not a fool about it. A young woman alone with papers that could hang the most powerful man in the valley was a young woman who could disappear the way those two homesteaders had disappeared, and be explained away just as easily. She told no one at first. She put the papers back in the cellar and the feed bin back over the trapdoor, and she thought. For a hard month, the way her father had taught her to think about a dangerous horse, slow from the side, never head on into the teeth of it. Then she went to find the one law Skier did not own. It took her the better part of the winter and a hard ride to the territorial capital, but there was, she had learned, a federal land office, and the water claims Kettleman had documented, filed under the names of dead men, were a federal matter, outside the reach of a valley judge. She carried Kettleman's papers to a United States land agent, a careful, humorless man, who read them and then read them again with his humorlessness slowly turning to something sharper. Because falsified federal water filings were exactly the kind of thing that ended men, and the graves of two homesteaders were exactly the kind of thing that brought marshals who did not answer to Harlan Skier. She did not hand over the originals. She had learned caution from Kettleman himself, but certified copies, witnessed, with the originals lodged where Skier could not reach them. The land agent asked her, before she left, whether she understood what she was starting and whether she had people who could look out for her while it played out. She told him the truth, that she had a stable, a filly, and a good ear, and that the man had killed her father by inches and taken his horse for a debt, and that she had made her peace with the risk on the day she decided to ride to the capital. The agent looked at her a long moment across his desk, this plain, square-handed girl who spoke of ruin the way other people spoke of weather. And then he stood and shook her hand, which she would remember later was a thing men in offices did not usually do for a woman in a trail-worn dress. And then she rode home to Bishop's Fork and waited, and kept her stable and gentled her horses, and did not look over her shoulder more than a careful woman should. Twice that winter riders she did not know came through Bishop's Fork asking after the livery girl, and both times Cyrus Boone's forge went quiet, and the big smith stepped into his doorway with a hammer in his fist and watched them until they rode on. He never spoke of it to her, and she never thanked him for it, but she understood that somewhere in the months of shared trade the man who had told her a woman couldn't run a livery had quietly decided that this one was under his protection, and that was its own kind of vindication, worth nearly as much as the reckoning to come. The reckoning, when it came the way a barn comes down after the first beam goes, slowly, then all at once. The federal investigation of the Ivory Cross water claims opened in the spring of 1892. The dead men's names on the filings could not be explained. The two graves were found where Kettleman's papers said they would be. Skier's bank, examined, proved to hold notes it had no right to hold. The judge Skier owned recused himself and then resigned. And Harlan Skier, who had come into the country with untraceable money and built a valley on debt, was indicted in a federal court that did not care what he owned locally, and the empire that had taken Wren's father's horse and 18 years of his life came apart in a single hard year. He did not hang. The homesteaders' deaths could not quite be laid at his own hand, only at his men's. But he was ruined, his range broken up, his water returned to the families he had stolen it from. Some of those families were still in the valley, some got their ground back. It was not everything. But it was a true accounting, 13 years late, and it had come out of a hole beneath a feed bin in a condemned stable. Wren Delacroix's name was in the newspapers for a while, and she disliked it, and let it pass. What she cared about was the stable. The gold she used the way Kettleman had wanted, honestly above board, taxes paid, to make the Bishop's Fork livery the best in that end of the territory. New roof, rebuilt corrals, a proper forge partnership with Cyrus Boone next door, the finest boarding barn between two railheads. She bred horses, and broke them gentle, and never once took a horse from a man for a debt, though she had cause enough some seasons, because she had stood in a yard and watched that done to her, and she had sworn it would not be done by her. Or Entice at the bank, who had told her she'd regret the place by snowfall, came to board his own carriage team at her stable within 2 years, and had the grace to say he'd misjudged the building and the buyer both. She did one more thing, in the second year, when the gold in the stable and the reckoning had all settled into their places. She had never forgotten the bay gelding they led out of the yard, her father's horse, raised from a foal, taken for a debt. She spent a season and a fair amount of that gold tracing him, from the Ivory Cross remuda to a horse trader to a farmer 3 valleys over. And she found him. Old now, sway-backed, gone gray around the muzzle, worn out in some stranger's plow harness. She bought him for more than he was worth, and she brought him home to the Bishop's Fork livery. And she never worked him another day in his life. He stood in the best back stall, the one the filly had fretted beside, and he grazed the rebuilt corral in the sun. And when children came to the stable, Wren would set them on his broad old back and lead them around the pen, and tell them if they asked that he had been her father's horse, and that some things a debt takes can be bought back if you live long enough and hold on hard enough to the honest work. He did not know her, at first. Too many years and too many hard hands had come between the foal her father raised and the worn-out old gelding she led home, and for a while he was only a tired horse in a good stall, gentle enough but shut somewhere inside himself the way ruined horses get. Wren did not push him. She knew better than anyone alive that you do not hurry a broken thing. She sat with him in the evenings and let him learn her voice, and one night in his second week home, brushing him down by lamplight in the back of the stable, she caught herself humming low the way her father used to hum in the corral at dusk, a tuneless working sound, more breath than song, and the old bay's head came around, and his ears came forward. And he pushed his gray muzzle against her chest and stood there breathing her in, and Wren Delacroix put her arms around her father's horse's neck in the lamplight, and finally, 13 years too late and exactly on time, let herself cry. If you ride through Bishop's Fork today, and it is still there, a small good horse town where its neighbors are gone, and the old folks will tell you the Delacroix livery is the reason, the stable still stands at what used to be the wrong end of the street, though there is no wrong end any more. The corral is sound. The hayloft is full. And in the feed room at the back, the great grain bin has been moved aside for good, and the oak trapdoor is left open under glass, and the dry cellar beneath it holds a lamp-lit display, a canvas-wrapped bundle of papers, an iron-strapped chest standing empty, a horseshoe worn thin, and a letter in a plain square hand. School children are brought there to hear the story of the honest liveryman who hid the truth about the man who owned the valley, and the broke girl with $10 and a good ear for horses who let a nervous filly lead her to it. There is a bay gelding buried out behind the corral, under a marker, and the marker does not give his name, because a horse does not need one. It says only, "He came home." There is a kind of inheritance that does not travel through families or banks. It waits in the dark under honest work, beneath the feed bins and the floorboards of the world, for the one person whose hands are honest enough to be trusted with it, and the horses always know that person before the people do. A liveryman 13 years dead had understood that better than anyone, that you do not leave the most important thing you own to the strongest hands or the richest, but to the honest ones, and that honest hands can be recognized, if you know where to wait for them. The world had told Wren Delacroix she was worthless the same way it had told that stable it was condemned, with a lien and a low price, and a door hanging off its hinge. It only ever takes one person with honest hands to prove the world's judgment wrong. Ren Delacroix was 22 years old and flat broke. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on a condemned livery stable in a fading cattle town in the Montana Territory. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, has an animal ever known something was wrong before you did? We'd love to hear your story. See you in the next one.